Module 2 introduced the overall structure of adaptation. Module 3 focuses on the risk assessment, which is an initial part of adaptation. The objective of Module 3 is to deepen your understanding of the risk assessment process by explaining the procedure in accordance with ISO 14091 and by introducing practical examples drawing from Japan's knowledge and experience. The ISO 14091 standard allows any organization to conduct a risk assessment in its respective areas of concern. This module is intended for local government officials in developing countries who are involved in adaptation and disaster prevention planning in their regions. As such, examples are taken from the disaster prevention sector. The structure of ISO 14091 is shown here. Note that the risk assessment described in ISO 14091 is generalized so that it can be utilized by any organization in any sector. The standard is not specific to the adaptation planning of local governments in developing countries. It contains several examples in the annexes, but they can also be regarded as cases. Parts 2 through 5 of this module corresponds to these parts of the ISO standard. Some of the content of ISO chapters 5 and 7 shares common features with Module 2, and is therefore omitted from Module 3. The title of ISO 14091 is Vulnerability, Impact, and Risk Assessment. The vulnerability assessments and risk assessments in this context are virtually identical. ISO 14091 mostly uses the word risk assessment for explanation. An impact assessment constitutes the first half of a risk assessment. A risk assessment assesses the impacts of climate change on societies and ecosystems. The overall risk is assessed by additionally considering adaptive capacity. This module explains how to assess future climate risks. We hope that this module contributes to your planning and resource mobilization activities. Note, in particular, that the preliminary assessment will be key to subsequent activities. This part introduces the risk assessment framework. The general descriptions in the ISO standard will be supplemented with case examples from Japan. The purposes of risk assessment are to know that climate change increases risks, to prioritize selected risks from the countless issues at play, and to identify possible measures that can be taken. The prioritization of risks in a quantitative manner is often difficult. Value-based judgment can be applied to prioritize risks based on the values of residents, local government officers, and experts. The first step of a risk assessment is to identify risks that will have significant impacts on the region and to clarify the relationship between impacts and the hazards. Screening and impact chain development are conducted for this purpose. Next, a future climate projection is prepared for each scenario to see how climate change can change risks. For example, flooding hazard can be projected by inputting changed rainfall conditions in a river flooding model. Then, the risk is evaluated based on the hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities. This is the flow of an impact assessment performed in Japan. The purposes of risk assessment are to estimate the effects of climatic hazards that can occur in the future and to promote adaptation and disaster prevention measures to reduce corresponding risks. The Climate Change Impact Assessment Report of Japan will be shown as an example. The Climate Change Adaptation Law requires to compile an impact assessment report, and the output is reflected into a national climate change adaptation plan. A national adaptation plan has been established by law in Japan through the aforesaid steps. Local municipalities have been preparing local adaptation plans, but not all of the plans have been completed. The Impact Assessment Report of Japan analyzes how climate change can impact society and the economy. The report will be updated every 5 years in order to revise the National Adaptation Plan. A large team of researchers prepares this report for the Ministry of the Environment, Japan. ISO also recommends that an impact assessment be periodically updated, with the publication of a concise report. For the 2021 report, an assessment was conducted on 7 sectors, and cross-cutting impact in addition. The issues were divided into 32 categories, with further breakdown into subcategories. The classification for natural disasters and the coastal area sector is shown here. 3 viewpoints for evaluation are defined: significance, urgency, and confidence. Significance is evaluated by the extent of future impacts on society, economy, and the environment. More care is needed when dealing with a risk that has a stronger, wider, and irreversible impact. Since climate change is a long-term phenomenon, the assessment should clarify when the impact will be apparent and when decisions will have to be made. The urgency is higher if countermeasures should be initiated soon. Prediction cannot avoid uncertainty. Confidence is higher when the consensus among experts is strong or the quantity and quality of evidence are high. The ISO also insists on the importance of communicating the uncertainty of the outputs. The figure compares the latest results in the disaster prevention sector with the results 5 years ago. The confidence of some items has been increased through the accumulation of knowledge. Mounting evidence also reveals that flooding and coastal erosion will be critical even if climate change is mitigated to a certain extent. Periodical reviews provide more appropriate scientific knowledge when updating the National Adaptation Plan. The next 3 slides show simple causal chains of 3 kinds of disasters taken from the report. They are all graded as high in significance, urgency, and confidence. The cause of flooding is rain in the upper reaches. The rising sea level also increases the risk of flooding in downstream areas. In the case of Japan, changes in the tropical cyclones are expected to increase damage, as the tropical cyclones are the main cause of high tides. The rising sea level also increases the risk of flooding in coastal areas due to high tides. The increase in total rainfall and/or rain intensity will increase the frequency and scale of landslide disasters. The risk of landslides depends on the soil type and steepness of the slope. There are 2 types of meteorological forcing to consider in risk assessment: extreme event, and slow onset. Climate change may change the frequency and intensity of extreme events. The impact of slow onset becomes apparent gradually over several decades. These meteorological forcings induce hazards that cause impacts. ISO 14091 describes a general procedure to understand risks caused by climate change. The standard is abstracted so that it can be applied not only to any region, but also to any subject, such as a country or a company. Part 2 explains the framework of the Impact Assessment Report of Japan regarding significance, urgency, and certainty, and then gives 3 examples of natural disasters and the coastal area sector. As a risk assessment can be used for both regional adaptation planning and disaster prevention planning, it makes a useful policy decision-making tool. Part 3 introduces the concept of an impact chain. It corresponds to Section 6.1 of ISO 14091. The use of an impact chain and the process to develop one will be explained by introducing cases from Japan. An impact chain is a tool to map climatic hazards and risks. It can be used for screening and prioritization in the early stage of a risk assessment. As a methodology, an impact chain is generic and can be applied to any sector. A detailed description of impact chains can be found in Chapter 2 of GIZ's Risk Supplement to the Vulnerability Sourcebook. An impact chain will help you understand the complex relationship of climate impact with your region. The factors contributing to vulnerability in a region becomes intuitive through the illustrated relationship and serve as foundations for prioritization when planning regional adaptation. This paves way for the next step of a risk assessment. The structure of the impact chain is explained based on the sourcebook. The hazards and their impacts, vulnerabilities, and exposures are arranged from left to right or from top to bottom to show the risks arising from their relationships. Each item constituting a risk, such as rainfall or flooding, is indicated as a factor. Adaptation measures corresponding to risk factors may be added. Here we will introduce case studies from Japan on impact chains. The first shows impact chains in an impact assessment report. The second covers VULU-PES, a system used to calculate vulnerability indexes from impact chains. The third is a technical cooperation project to transfer VULU-PES to researchers in Indonesia. The Japanese impact assessment report describes the development of impact chains for all sectors, although in a format different from that used in the sourcebook. Impact chains can also be used to enhance coordination among sectors, as they can be illustrated in relation to other disciplines. According to the sourcebook, development should start from a specific risk of your interest. Impact chains in the Impact Assessment Report is designed differently, with a view to providing a comprehensive perspective on the natural disaster sector at the national level and to facilitating an understanding of relationships of this sector with other sectors. It is a structure with several related impact chains connected. Japan also carried out a project to develop a system for assessing vulnerability to climate change in each region for the support of regional adaptation planning. VOL-PES, which was created under this project, used statistical data to measure the aspects of climate change to which Japan was vulnerable, and which factors made Japan more vulnerable. This is an impact chain for landslides created under this project. The project invited officers in a municipality interested in adaptation to develop impact chains in a workshop. Adaptation priorities in their region were discussed based on their observations. Chapters 3 to 5 of the sourcebook describe how a vulnerability index can be calculated from an impact chain with quantitative data. The project applied this method to prepare a vulnerability diagnosis for each local government by identifying major risks and the contributing factors. The Ministry of the Environment Japan carried out a technical cooperation project on adaptation in Indonesia. Impact chains for 8 risks, including floods, were developed by Japanese experts and local researchers. Corresponding data were then identified to calculate a vulnerability index using VOL-PES across Indonesia. A manual on how the study findings can be reflected into policy was also prepared. This is an output regarding floods. Quantitative data are identified for most of the factors. Vulnerability indexes were calculated for all Indonesian provinces to identify vulnerable sectors and regions. This map is a visual representation of a vulnerability index. As an outcome, this project introduces the steps from the development of impact chains to the calculation of vulnerability indexes that Indonesian researchers can now replicate. As some of the participating researchers are policy advisors to the Indonesian government, it is expected that this method will be used to prioritize risks to be addressed in Indonesia's national development and adaptation plans. Impact chains can be used to prioritize adaptation challenges, with or without quantitative data, and can serve as a basis for risk assessment. We encourage you to develop an impact chain covering a risk you are concerned about, either by yourself or with a small group of colleagues. Let's see how we can make an impact chain. First, decide your risk of interest. In this case example, we will choose flooding. Next, identify relevant hazards and then their effects. When it rains heavily, the river level rises and damaging floods occur. Next, identify vulnerability. Some of dikes may have been breached in the past. This may be considered a vulnerability. And identify the exposure. It is socio-economically valuable to protect things, for example, human lives, houses, or property, from meteorological disasters. Think about potential measures to reduce these risks as much as possible. See the GIZ's sourcebook for detailed instructions. As we have seen, an impact chain is an effective way to understand the complex impacts of climate change, consider countermeasures, and prioritize them. Even without quantitative data, an impact chain can be created with empirical knowledge. While an impact chain illustrates the relationship between climate and impact, it is not a risk assessment for future climate change. In the next part we will discuss methods for predicting future risks. The process of impact chain development described in Part 3 identifies vulnerability and a structure. Climate adaptation is a process to deal with vulnerabilities in the future. In this part, we will introduce case studies from Japan in accordance with the ISO and explain a number of methods for predicting future risks. A procedure for future risk assessment is illustrated here. First, hazard projections, such as projections on areas likely to be submerged by river flooding, are made from climate models with greenhouse gas emission scenarios. Future risks are then deduced from the results and from exposure and vulnerability information obtained from impact chain analyses. A climate projection by itself doesn't provide much information to support decision-making. It is important to evaluate risks as social and economic values. One of the purposes of a risk assessment is to assess the upper limit of the cost for adaptation measures. Due to the enormous demands on computational resources, climate projections are run at spatial resolutions of more than tens of square kilometers. This resolution may be too rough to be useful for planning local adaptation. Tools are available, however, to obtain local-scale weather and climate from global data. We call these tools downscalers. See Module 5 for more information. The future climate will be determined by the extent of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The reduction achieved will not depend solely on the policies of your country, but on the policies of the whole world. A set of scenarios were developed to forecast how much investment will be made in emission reduction, and how wealth can be allocated to improving lives and international cooperation, in order to make climate projections. The decisions we make will inevitably have to take such sources of uncertainty into account. Properly dealing with climate models and global warming scenarios may turn out to be too complicated. When that happens, we can use alternative information. If your country has developed or is developing a national adaptation plan, it will be given a climate outlook at the national level. It is also reasonable to assume that the observed trends in climate and weather disasters in your region will continue. For future risk prediction, for example, you will need a model that predicts hazards such as river flooding. Depending on your sector or risk, online tools may be available for free. 3 tools on river flooding are shown here. See Module 5 for details. Some of the tools available, such as RRI and HEC, can only be used by experienced river engineers. Others, such as the Aqueduct Flood Tool, can be easily used by local government officials. The procedures for the impact assessment conducted in Japan are summarized as follows. Based on this data, we are making models, combining them with climate predictions to evaluate future effects, and considering adaptation measures. Here is an example of another impact assessment by Japanese researchers. First, they projected the risk of flooding along the coast at the end of the 21st century due to sea level rises and tides, as well as the population to be exposed. Next, they compiled a database of the extent and cost of reducing the disaster population and damage by strengthening embankments. Taking into account the existing embankments, they found that it would be economically rational to implement adaptation measures in the world as a whole. 35 local municipalities in Japan were involved in a program to develop impact evaluation models and promote the implementation of adaptation measures in their respective regions, with support from consultants. Here we will introduce 3 cases from the disaster prevention sector. A projection on inland flooding was conducted for an inland area near Tokyo. The projection included exposure to risks such as land use, the age of structures, and the age of the population. In addition to updating hazard maps and strengthening drainage capacity, the local government also considered land use plans as adaptive measures. In Lake Inba, located in the basin of the Tone River, a climate model predicted that rainfall intensity would increase and that the water temperature would rise in the basin, leading to increasing floods and water quality deterioration. A literature review was conducted to develop a water quality prediction model. Numerical data, including a climate projection, were input to the model. 22 measures in 3 sectors, namely, flood control, improvement of the water quality of inflow water, and the environmental management of lakes, were examined from the viewpoints of feasibility and effectiveness. Irrigation ponds in Kyushu, southern Japan, are aging. If the ponds collapse, flood damage during heavy rains will worsen. The local government developed and applied a model to predict if the risk to the ponds could be reduced sufficiently when they introduced adaptive measures. The research team also proposed a plan to strengthen the disaster prevention capacity of the region on this issue. The projection of climate change hazards has been mainly discussed. Exposures and vulnerabilities, mostly affecting human society, also change over time, which results in changes to the risk. Quantitative projections should cover such changes as extensively possible in order to produce robust results. Information of this type will serve as evidence to support reasonable political decisions. In the Japanese cases, many quantitative data and scientific knowledge were needed to use the complex models. When knowledge and expertise are limited, a simpler but similar analysis can be done using an impact chain and data from the past. While the results will not be robust enough for EBPM, they can be used to prioritize issues. Choose indicators corresponding to factors in the impact chain. Here you see an example of indicators for the flooding risk of a river. In this case, an increase in the forest area is expected to reduce the risk. Future projections of these indicators can be used to predict risk. Monitoring these values can help assess actual changes in the risk. The procedure for a simple risk assessment does not differ much from that seen in the cases from Japan. Understanding the adaptation needs by local government officials, possibly with minimal external support, can provide some risk information. A simple risk assessment can also serve as a screening process for a more detailed assessment to be done. It isn't easy for local governments to produce highly reliable risk predictions. Even developed countries rely on the help of external consultants and researchers, with support from the central government. Estimation of the financial value of risks is a key component, but this type of estimation generally remains in the research phase even in Japan. We have introduced risk assessment as a process to produce basic information for the development of adaptation plans for a region. Part 5 explains how risk information will be utilized in policy. Risk information for climate change adaptation provides insight on how future changes in risk will affect human life and local socioeconomic activities. Its utility for the projection of hazards, on the other hand, is limited. The most persuasive type of risk information is an estimate of future damages from climate change. Though not predictions per se, information on past data, hazard trends, vulnerability indicators, etc. may also be helpful for policy decision-making. When there is insufficient information to estimate the amount of damage, or if a risk that concerns you is difficult to assess in terms of economic value, as in the case with the conservation of natural ecosystems, for example, it may be possible to make the assessment based on the qualitative values of residents, administrators, or experts. There are 3 uses of risk information. Throughout this material, we have explained that risk information can be used for developing adaptation and disaster prevention plans for a region. It can serve as the basis for explaining the need for resource mobilization for adaptation and disaster prevention projects. In addition, risk information can be used to provide public information to encourage residents and business sectors to cooperate with the adaptation plan and promote voluntary initiatives. The ultimate purpose of using risk information is to enhance the adaptability of the local community. An adaptation plan allows you to optimize adaptation measures for your region. A plan will support the implementation of measures if it is reflected into the plans of each sector, e.g., the disaster prevention sector. This is the idea of mainstreaming, as explained in Module 2. Risk information is fundamental for evidence-based policymaking, or EBPM. When coordinating the financing for the implementation of disaster prevention projects, the rationale for the disaster prevention investment needs to be explained to the budgeting authorities or international cooperation agencies. Clear risk information provides an advantage in prioritizing resource mobilization for adaptation measures. To enhance the engagement of residents and private sectors on the adaptation and disaster prevention plans, risk information needs to be provided. Risk information can also encourage them to take voluntary measures to reduce the risks. Japan, Thailand, and the Philippines, for example, have websites that publish risk information for this purpose. The implementation of adaptation measures requires resource mobilization. For example, the cost of implementing adaptation measures, such as the building of dikes, must be substantially lower than the total social and economic losses forecasted in future disaster scenarios. Planning reasonable adaptation measures based on risk information is a prerequisite for resource mobilization. Each funding source has a dedicated purpose and requires justification in such a context. In this regard, it is necessary to devise ways to utilize risk information for explanatory purposes. Developing countries usually have access to international support in addition to domestic budget. It is particularly important to explain the cost and benefit aspect for mobilizing domestic budget for the implementation of adaptation measures. A comparison of the estimated cumulative damage towards the future with the total cost of adaptation measures will provide this explanation. Even if quantitative data are unavailable, you also have the option of requesting additional budget allocation in your daily work using risk information for incremental adaptation measures. International cooperation agencies and funds set priorities in their policies. In addition to traditional donors, climate finances are characteristic sources for the funding of adaptation measures. The Climate Technology Center and Network, or CTCN, is a technical cooperation mechanism to provide technical cooperation in response to requests from the governments of developing countries. The Green Climate Fund, or GCF, is a suitable fund for scaling up proven adaptation measures nationwide. When seeking support from international cooperation agencies and funds, it is important to understand their strategies, their business plans, and the sizes of their budgets, and to bring project ideas in line with their interests. Planning, resource mobilization, and information provision are key for substantial adaptation. The effective use of risk information will enhance the adaptive capacity of your region, which will lead to a more climate-resilient community. Now revisiting Module 3. Impact assessment reports have been prepared in Japan to update the adaptation plan every 5 years. We have showcased the framework for assessing the impact from the viewpoints of significance, urgency, and confidence, an outline of assessment results in the field of disaster prevention, and the procedure for risk assessment. An impact chain is an effective way to understand the complex impacts of climate change, to consider adaptation measures, and to prioritize them. This is the first step of a risk assessment. It can be informative even when no quantitative data are available. Risk predictions are made by adding future climate predictions to regional vulnerabilities analyzed through impact chains. Preparing reliable risk information that can be used for EBPM is important. Quantitative and reliable projections support policy implementation through planning, resource mobilization, and information sharing. In terms of policymaking, risk information serves as a basis for planning and resource mobilization in particular. This is an EBPM process. Module 4 will introduce adaptation planning at the local level. It will also present examples of how risk information can be used for implementation.